The next section is the taxation chapter. So this chapter really deals with three major issues. First of all, the power of the First Nation to tax. And there are two essential powers. One is a power in the treaty to actually levy taxes on your citizens. And secondly, a power to negotiate agreements outside of treaty, much as is the situation now under the Indian Act, where your governments will be able to tax everybody on treaty settlement land. It's anticipated that after treaty, First Nations will be able to levy property taxes on people on treaty settlement land, will be able to levy retail sales taxes, as many of the First Nations do now, and will also have a share of the income tax that's collected on treaty settlement land. Naturally, the First Nation will then have the ability to determine what it wants to do with those monies to support its government. The basic idea, and obviously this is something that many people will have to discuss and debate in the coming years, is that any additional money that the federal government or provincial government gets from any loss or change in the tax exemption will flow back to the First Nation, so that the First Nation is not out of pocket or the loser because of the changes in the tax system. The second major part of the tax chapter deals with what's called the tax treatment agreement. And essentially these are commitments that, first of all, certain aspects of the First Nation government will not be subject to taxation at all. Certain unused lands, First Nation institutions, buildings, the wellness center at Songhees, for example, are buildings that are public institutions and will not be subject to tax. Then there will also be an agreement that will be put in place to ensure that the taxes, any taxes that do come into effect, are brought into effect in a way that protects the old tax exemption, makes sure that people aren't taxed on anything that they earned before any taxes came into effect. So, for example, any value that they have in their property, and generally ensure that the taxes are carried out in a fair way that recognizes the fact that there's a First Nation government with different interests and with protections that should be given to a government. The last part of the tax chapter will deal with, and this has not been spelled out in detail yet, how the transition from the Indian Act to the non-Indian Act will be dealt with. The tax exemption is under the Indian Act, and so one of the problems with giving up the Indian Act is that the taxation provisions in the Indian Act will no longer apply, including the tax exemption. Also, because there will no longer be reserves, and the tax exemption only applies on reserves, the tax exemption in the Indian Act could not apply anyway. So the government has agreed that there will be a tax exemption included in the tax chapter, which will provide for a transition period before taxes would be imposed. That transition period is expected to be at least 10 or 12 years, although the details of that are yet to be worked out. What's important to keep in mind when this discussion is happening is that, of course, if taxation ever does come into effect on treaty settlement land, and certainly still TTA's position that it won't, that anybody will still enjoy the ordinary tax exemptions that everybody enjoys. So, for example, low-income people typically are protected from most income taxes and get refunds with respect to GST. So those protections will still be there for everybody. It's also expected that there will be a lengthy transition period. And finally, it's expected that any taxes that are collected will flow back to the government over time. That is, to the First Nation government over time.